There was a man driving home on Christmas Eve. Highway stretched empty ahead, brake lights scattered like dying stars. Radio playing the same songs it played every year, same station, same nostalgia he couldn't quite name. He'd been driving for 3 hours, and somewhere around mile marker 147, he realized he didn't want to arrive. Not because he hated his family, because he'd become someone he didn't recognize, and Christmas had a way of forcing you to see it. You clicked on this video because you know that feeling. Not the holiday itself, but the weight that comes with it, the pressure to be someone you're not, the exhaustion of pretending everything's fine, the quiet terror that another year has passed and you're still stuck. You've spent this year watching everyone else level up while you stayed frozen, convincing yourself that next year will be different, that you'll finally become the person you keep promising yourself you'll be. But what if I told you that the moment everything changes isn't January 1st? What if I told you it's right now, in this season you've been dreading, in this window between who you are and who you're capable of becoming? By the end of this video, you'll understand why you've been stuck and the exact internal shift that separates people who transform from people who just keep making the same New Year's resolutions. This isn't about motivation, this is about the quiet moment when you finally stop negotiating with yourself. His name was Marcus, 37 years old, senior analyst at a consulting firm, divorced 2 years ago, living in a rental apartment he still hadn't bothered to decorate. The highway was dark, and Marcus kept the radio just loud enough to drown out his thoughts, but not loud enough to actually distract him. Every Christmas was the same ritual. Drive 3 hours to his parents' house, smile through dinner, deflect questions about his life, drive home alone, promise himself next year would be different, but it never was. This year felt heavier though, maybe because his younger sister had just bought her second house, or his brother had just made partner at his law firm, or his cousin Sarah had posted photos of her family's vacation to Italy. Everyone was winning except Marcus, and Christmas had a cruel way of putting that on display. 3 hours is a long time to think. Long enough to replay every decision that led here, every moment where he chose comfort over risk, every time he told himself later and watched later turn into never. He wasn't depressed. That would have been easier to name, easier to fix. He was just stuck, like a car spinning its wheels in snow, engine running, going nowhere. Around mile marker 189, Marcus noticed something strange. The car in front of him had been driving at exactly the same speed for 20 minutes, matching every lane change Marcus made, like a ghost following him home. Then the car pulled into a rest stop, and Marcus, for reasons he couldn't explain, followed. He wasn't tired, he didn't need gas, he just followed. The rest stop was nearly empty, just a few truckers and one old man sitting alone at a picnic table despite the December cold, drinking coffee from a thermos, staring at nothing. Marcus walked inside, bought a coffee he didn't want, and when he came back out, the old man was still there. "You running towards something or away from something?" the man asked without looking up. Marcus stopped. "Excuse me?" "Your face. I've seen that look before. People don't stop at rest stops this late unless they're running." Marcus wanted to walk away, get back in his car, forget this weird interaction. Instead, he sat down. "Neither," Marcus said. "I'm just going to Christmas dinner." The old man smiled. "That's not an answer." And something about that, the directness, the lack of social performance, cracked something open in Marcus. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think I'm just going through motions." The old man nodded slowly. "You know what the problem with Christmas is? It's a mirror. Shows you who you were supposed to be next to who you actually are. Most people spend the whole season avoiding that mirror. Are you some kind of therapist? Marcus asked. Nah, just someone who wasted a lot of years avoiding mirrors. The man stood up, poured the rest of his coffee onto the frozen ground, and walked toward a beat-up truck. Before he got in, he turned back. You want to know when things change? When you stop waiting for permission to become who you are. Merry Christmas, kid. Then he was gone. Marcus sat there for another 20 minutes, coffee going cold in his hands, breath visible in the December air. And for the first time in years, he asked himself a question he'd been avoiding. What am I actually doing with my life? Is less than #0. 6# is greater than, not rhetorically, really asking, because somewhere between the divorce and the promotion that never came and the apartment he'd stopped caring about, Marcus had stopped building a life and started just existing, going through the motions, checking boxes, waiting for something to change. But nothing changes when you're just waiting. He got back in his car, pulled onto the highway, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't turn on the radio. He just drove in silence, listening to the sound of his own thoughts, feeling the weight of everything he'd been avoiding. And somewhere between that rest stop and his parents' driveway, something shifted. Not a decision yet, just a crack in the foundation of who he'd been. His parents' house smelled the same pine, cinnamon, his mother's perfume, decorations everywhere. Lights on the tree, stockings hung, the whole performance of Christmas exactly as it had been every year since Marcus was a child. His sister Emma was already there with her husband and 2 kids, looking perfect as always, like a catalog photo of what success was supposed to look like. His brother David arrived 10 minutes after Marcus, carrying expensive wine and stories about his recent courtroom victory. Marcus hugged everyone, said the right things, settled into his usual spot at the table, the chair that had somehow become his over the years, positioned where he could see everyone but remain mostly unnoticed. Dinner began the way it always did, his father leading a prayer, his mother fussing over food, his sister's kids asking when they could open presents. Then came the questions. So Marcus, his father said, cutting into ham, how's work? Fine. Same. Still at the consulting firm? Yeah. His father nodded, already losing interest, already turning to David to ask about his cases. This was the dance they'd been doing for years, Marcus giving short answers, everyone accepting them and moving on because nobody really wanted to dig deeper. But this time, sitting there watching his family talk around him, Marcus felt something different. Not hurt, he was used to being the forgettable one. Anger. Anger at himself for accepting this role, for making himself so small and unremarkable that people literally forgot to include him in conversations. His sister was talking about their family vacation to the Bahamas, her husband nodding along, her kids interrupting with their own versions of the story. His brother was explaining some complex legal strategy that Marcus didn't understand and didn't care about. His parents were listening, engaged, asking follow-up questions. And Marcus was just there, eating food, existing in the background, waiting for dinner to end. But then his nephew, 7 years old, barely paying attention to adult conversation, looked at Marcus and asked, Uncle Marcus, what's the coolest thing that happened to you this year? The table went quiet. Everyone turned to Marcus, suddenly remembering he existed, suddenly curious about this person they'd been ignoring for the last 45 minutes. Marcus opened his mouth to say something safe, something that wouldn't require follow-up questions. But instead, what came out was nothing. His sister laughed uncomfortably. Come on, something must have happened. No, Marcus said. and he wasn't being self-deprecating or modest. He was just being honest. Nothing cool happened to me this year. I went to work, I came home, I watched TV, I ordered takeout, I went to sleep. I did that for 12 months. Nothing happened. The silence that followed was different, not comfortable, not polite, but heavy with truth nobody wanted to acknowledge. His mother tried to smooth it over. Well, work has been busy, I'm sure. Mom, I sit in a cubicle and make spreadsheets nobody reads. My boss doesn't know my name. I haven't had a meaningful conversation with a human being in 6 months. Nothing happened. His nephew, not understanding the weight of what he just caused, said, "That sounds boring." And Marcus smiled, a real smile for the first time all night. "Yeah, buddy, it is boring." His father cleared his throat. "Marcus, this isn't really the time." "When is the time?" Marcus asked, not aggressively, just genuinely curious. "When is it appropriate to admit that I'm 37 years old and I have nothing to show for it? That I wake up every day and go through the motions and pretend it's fine?" His sister looked at her husband uncomfortably. His brother stared at his plate. His mother looked like she might cry. But Marcus wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was just finally being honest. And honesty, after years of polite silence, felt like breaking the surface of water after being underwater too long. "I'm not trying to ruin Christmas," Marcus said quietly. "I'm just tired of pretending." Nobody knew what to say to that. So they did what families do when truth gets uncomfortable. They changed the subject, moved on, returned to safer topics. But Marcus couldn't move on. Couldn't return to safe because something had cracked open that couldn't be closed again. After dinner, Marcus stood in the kitchen helping his mother clean dishes, and she finally asked the question he knew was coming, "Are you okay?" "I don't know," Marcus said. "I thought I was, but I don't think I am." His mother dried a plate slowly. "What do you need?" Marcus laughed, not unkindly. "I think I need to stop living like this." "Like what?" "Like I'm waiting for my life to start." His mother didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. Because the truth was, this was Marcus's. To figure out nobody could fix this for him, nobody could give him permission to change, nobody could save him from the life he'd built through 1,000 small compromises. He drove home that night. Same highway, same exits, same quiet darkness. But when he pulled into his apartment parking lot, instead of going inside, he just sat in his car, engine off. Heater fading, December cold seeping in, and he made a decision. Not a perfect decision, not a dramatic resolution, just a quiet commitment to stop accepting fine as good enough. Because fine wasn't good enough anymore. Fine was a slow death, a life unlived, a version of himself that had stopped trying. And if that dinner table moment had shown him anything, it was that he couldn't spend another year being someone even he found boring. Marcus sat in his parked car for 2 hours, not scrolling his phone, not listening to music, just sitting in the silence, staring at the dashboard clock as minutes ticked past midnight into Christmas morning. Around 1:47 a.m., he finally went inside. His apartment looked different somehow, not physically, but in the way it felt, like he was seeing it through someone else's eyes. The furniture he'd bought at IKEA 3 years ago and never upgraded, the walls still white and bare. The kitchen with dishes piled in the sink. The living room with a couch positioned toward a TV that was always on. This wasn't a home, it was a waiting room. A place to exist between work and sleep. A space that required nothing from him and gave nothing back. Marcus opened his fridge. Leftover Chinese food from 4 days ago. Beer, condiments, nothing that required actual cooking. He opened his closet, Same 5 shirts rotated endlessly, same 2 pairs of jeans, same jacket he'd worn since his 20s. He looked at his bathroom counter. Generic soap, cheap razor, toothbrush, deodorant, the absolute minimum required to maintain basic hygiene. Everything in his life had been reduced to minimum, to just enough, to whatever required the least effort. But here's what Marcus realized sitting there at 2 a.m. on Christmas morning. He hadn't always been like this. There was a version of himself, younger, hungrier, more alive, who had wanted things, who had dreamed about building something meaningful, who had believed he was capable of extraordinary. What happened to that person? When did he trade ambition for comfort, passion for convenience, aliveness for just existing? Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened his email, scrolling back through years of messages, job applications he'd never sent, opportunities he'd ignored, invitations he'd declined, conversations that had faded because he stopped responding. A whole archive of potential lives he'd walked away from because they required risk, change, effort. Then he opened his photos. The last genuine smile on his face was from 2 years ago at his friend's wedding before the divorce, before the promotion that never came, before he'd given up on himself. Everything since then was just documentation, proof he'd been places, done things, but with a face that looked like it was going through motions. At 3:15 a.m., Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out a notebook, an old one from college he'd found while unpacking after the divorce and never opened again, and he started writing. Not journaling, not making lists, just writing. I'm 37 years old and I have nothing I'm proud of. I'm not unhappy exactly, but I'm not alive either. I've spent years avoiding discomfort and ended up creating a life that's entirely uncomfortable. I don't recognize myself anymore. I want to want things again. I want to care about something. I want to wake up with purpose instead of dread. I want to be someone I respect. The sun started rising around 6:30 a.m., pale light filtering through his blinds, and Marcus realized he hadn't slept at all. But he didn't feel tired, he felt awake in a way he hadn't in years. Something had shifted, not in his circumstances, but in his willingness to see them clearly, to stop lying to himself about what his life had become. And with that clarity came a strange kind of relief, because you can't change what you won't acknowledge, and Marcus had spent years not acknowledging that he'd stopped living. He made coffee, sat at his kitchen table, and asked himself the question the old man at the rest stop had planted. What am I running from? The answer came slowly, uncomfortably, himself. He was running from the version of himself that had dreams, because dreams could fail. Running from the version that wanted connection, because connection could hurt. Running from the version that tried hard, because trying hard meant risking disappointment. He'd built an entire life designed to avoid pain, and in the process, he'd also avoided joy, meaning, growth, aliveness. He'd become so good at protecting himself that he'd imprisoned himself. But here's what changed that Christmas morning. Marcus realized he'd rather risk the pain of trying and failing than continue the slow suffocation of not trying at all. Not because he suddenly became brave, but because he finally understood that staying stuck was its own kind of suffering, just slower, quieter, more socially acceptable. At 8:47 a.m., Marcus opened a new document on his laptop and titled it Non-Negotiables. Not goals, not resolutions, not wishes, non-negotiables. The things he would do regardless of how he felt, regardless of circumstances, regardless of fear, and he started writing. Marcus didn't wait for January. He didn't wait for motivation. for the perfect moment, for courage to magically appear. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, he made 3 phone calls. The first was to his ex-wife. They hadn't spoken in 8 months, not out of animosity, just the natural drift of 2 people who'd realized they'd married the wrong person and quietly separated without drama. She answered on the 3rd ring, surprised. Marcus? Hey Lauren, I know this is random, but I need to ask you something. Silence on the other end. Cautious. When did you realize I'd given up? Marcus asked. More silence than, why are you asking me this? Because I need to know, when did you see it happen? Lauren sighed. Remember when you got passed over for that promotion 3 years ago? Yeah. You came home, said it was fine, and that was it. You never talked about it again. You never got angry, never fought for it, never looked for something better. You just accepted it. And I think that's when I realized you'd stopped fighting for anything, including us. The words landed heavy, but Marcus didn't flinch. Yeah, he said quietly. I think you're right. Why are you asking me this now? Because I'm trying to figure out who I became and how to become someone different. Lauren was quiet for a moment. That's good, Marcus. I hope you figure it out. They said goodbye, and Marcus felt something he didn't expect. Gratitude. Not for the marriage ending, but for the honesty, for someone finally telling him the truth he'd been avoiding. The second call was to his manager at work. Marcus had rehearsed what he'd say, how he'd frame it professionally, but when his boss answered, all the scripts fell away. I need to talk to you about something, Marcus said. Sure. Shoot. I've been doing the bare minimum for 2 years, and I think we both know it. I'm not asking for a second chance or making excuses. I just wanted to be honest about it. His boss was silent for a long moment. Is this your resignation? No, Marcus said. It's me telling you I'm going to start actually trying. And if that's not enough, if I've burned too many bridges, I understand. But I'm done pretending I'm engaged when I'm not. More silence than what changed. I did. Or I'm trying to. His boss exhaled. Okay, let's see what you've got. Marcus hung up feeling lighter, not because he'd secured his job, but because he'd stopped performing, stopped pretending, stopped hiding behind professional politeness. The third call was the hardest. He called his sister Emma. I need to apologize, Marcus said when she answered. For what? For ruining Christmas dinner. Marcus, you didn't. I did, and I'm sorry. But I'm not sorry for being honest. I'm sorry for doing it at the table, in front of everyone. Emma was quiet. You scared, Mom? I know. I'll call her too. But I wanted to talk to you first because I think I've been jealous of you for a long time. What? You have everything together. Perfect family, perfect life, perfect everything. And I think part of why I've been so stuck is because I kept comparing myself to you and feeling like I'd already lost. Emma laughed, but not unkindly. Marcus, I'm in therapy twice a week because I have panic attacks about whether I'm doing enough. My marriage is fine, but not great. My kids are exhausting. Nothing is perfect. I'm just good at performing. That stopped Marcus. Really? Everyone's performing, Marcus. The difference is you stopped performing and thought that meant you were failing. But actually, that might be the healthiest thing you've ever done. They talked for another 30 minutes, really talked, not the surface level updates they usually exchanged, and when they hung up, Marcus realized something. He'd spent years thinking he was behind everyone else, when really, everyone was just better at hiding their struggles. The 3 conversations didn't fix anything, didn't change his circumstances, didn't magically make his life better, but they did something more important. They ended the performance, the pretending, the careful curation of an acceptable version of himself. And in ending that, Marcus created space for something real to begin. Most people quit by January 3rd. They make resolutions on New Year's Eve, full of hope and intention, and within 72 hours, they're back to old patterns, old routines, old versions of themselves. Marcus knew this, he'd done it enough times himself, but something was different this time. It wasn't that he had more discipline or willpower, it was that he'd stopped believing in the myth of January 1st as the starting line. He'd started on December 26th, in the middle of the holiday chaos, when motivation was low and circumstances were messy, and that made all the difference. Because when you start from zero, when you start from the worst possible moment, you stop waiting for perfect conditions. You just start. January arrived, and Marcus watched his coworkers come back to the office full of new gym memberships, diet plans, productivity systems. He watched them talk about change with the same enthusiasm he'd heard every January for a decade. And he watched them fade within a week, not because they were weak, but because they'd built their change on motivation instead of decision. Motivation is weather, it comes and goes, rises and falls, depends entirely on conditions. Decision is foundation, it doesn't care how you feel, doesn't negotiate, doesn't need ideal circumstances. Marcus had made a decision on Christmas morning, and that decision didn't expire when he felt tired, didn't pause when circumstances got hard, didn't wait for him to feel ready. It just existed, consistent and immovable, regardless of his mood. Here's what that looked like practically. Every morning, he woke up at 5:30 a.m., not because he loved mornings, but because he decided that's when his day started. He'd work out for 30 minutes, not elaborate gym sessions, just bodyweight exercises in his living room. Because complexity is the enemy of consistency. He'd spend 1 hour before work learning something that actually mattered to his career, not just going through the motions. At work, he stopped checking email first thing and started tackling his hardest project, the one he'd been avoiding for months. He started asking questions in meetings, not to perform competence, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. He started saying no to tasks that were busy work and yes to projects that scared him. After work, instead of collapsing in front of the TV, he'd spend 30 minutes on something creative, writing, reading, anything that engaged his mind instead of numbing it. Before bed, he'd write 3 sentences about what changed that day, not for anyone else, just for himself, just to stay conscious of the transformation happening in small increments. None of this was dramatic. None of it looked like the transformation montages in movies. But after 30 days, Marcus looked around and realized his life was completely different, not because everything had changed, but because he had changed, and that shift rippled into everything else. His apartment still looked the same, but it felt different because he wasn't treating it like a waiting room anymore. His job was still the same, but his engagement was different because he'd stopped performing incompetence. His relationships were still complicated, but the honesty he'd started practicing made them feel more real. By February, people at work started noticing. His boss mentioned his improved performance in a team meeting. A colleague asked if he wanted to grab lunch, something that hadn't happened in 2 years. His sister texted him to see how he was doing, not out of obligation, but genuine curiosity. But here's what Marcus realized. He didn't need their validation anymore. The change wasn't happening for them, it was happening for him, and that made it sustainable. When you change to impress others, you stop when they stop noticing. When you change because you've decided that's who you are now, you keep going regardless of who's watching. Marcus had spent years seeking external validation, waiting for someone to recognize his potential, to give him permission to be extraordinary. But transformation doesn't work that way. Nobody gives you permission. You stop asking for it. March 14th, a random Tuesday. Nothing special about the day. Marcus was sitting in his car during lunch break, eating a sandwich, scrolling through his phone out of habit more than interest. Then his phone rang a number he didn't recognize. He answered. Marcus? It's Derek, from college. Marcus hadn't thought about Derek in 15 years. They'd been roommates freshman year, lost touch after graduation, the way most college friendships fade into occasional social media likes. Derek? Wow. How'd you get my number? Found you on LinkedIn. Listen, I know this is random, but I'm moving back to your city for work and I remembered you live there. Thought I'd reach out, see if you wanted to grab a beer, catch up. Marcus's first instinct was to make an excuse, to say he was busy, to avoid the social obligation. But then he remembered the decision he'd made on Christmas morning. Yeah, Marcus said. I'd like that. They met at a bar that Thursday, and Marcus barely recognized the person who showed up. Derek looked older, obviously, but more than that, he looked alive, like someone actively engaged in his life rather than passively moving through it. They ordered drinks, made small talk, and then Derek asked the question Marcus had been dreading. So what have you been up to the last 15 years? And for the first time in years, Marcus didn't perform an acceptable answer. He told the truth. Honestly, I've been coasting. Got a job, got married, got divorced, stayed at the same company doing work I don't care about. I've been basically sleepwalking through my 30s. Derek didn't look uncomfortable or surprised, he just nodded. Yeah, I did that for a while too. Took a job that looked good on paper, made decent money, hated every minute of it. Woke up at 35 thinking, what the hell am I doing? What changed? I quit, Derek said simply. Moved to Southeast Asia, spent 2 years figuring out what I actually wanted to do, started a small business, failed, started another one, made it work. Now I'm moving back because I got offered a partnership with a company I actually respect. Marcus felt something sharp in his chest, not envy exactly, but recognition. Derek had jumped, had risked everything, had chosen uncertainty over comfort. And here was Marcus, still sitting in the same chair, same company, same life, telling himself it was fine. I should have done that, Marcus said. It's not too late. I'm 37. So? Derek laughed. What? You think life ends at 40? You've probably got another 40 years ahead of you. You want to spend them in a job you hate? Living in an apartment you don't care about? Going through the motions until you die? The words landed hard, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Marcus had been acting like his life was already over, like the possibilities had closed, like he'd missed his chance. But what if that was just a story he'd been telling himself to avoid the discomfort of trying? What if I fail? Marcus asked. What if you don't? Derek countered. What if you actually succeed? What if 5 years from now you're sitting exactly where you want to be, doing exactly what you want to do, and you look back at this conversation thinking, thank God I jumped. They talked until the bar closed, and when Marcus drove home that night, something had fundamentally shifted. Not in his circumstances, those were still the same, but in his relationship to possibility. For the first time since Christmas, Marcus let himself imagine a life that wasn't just fine, a life that was actually extraordinary. What would that even look like? He started making a list not of goals, but of questions. What would I do if money weren't a factor? What would I try if I knew I couldn't fail? What do I want to be remembered for? What would I regret not attempting? Who do I want to become in the next 5 years? The answers didn't come immediately, but asking the questions was enough, because you can't find answers you're not willing to search for. That weekend, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He went to a bookstore, not to browse, but with intention. He bought 3 books about career transitions, 2 about starting businesses, 1 about making major life changes. He joined a climbing gym, not because he wanted to climb, but because he wanted to do something that required him to face physical fear in a controlled environment. He scheduled coffee with his boss to talk about career development, something he'd avoided for 3 years. None of these actions were perfect or dramatic, but they were all aligned with a version of himself that was actively building something instead of passively waiting. And that alignment, that consistency between who he said he wanted to be and how he actually spent his time, that's what transformation actually looks like. Not lightning bolt moments, but small choices compounded until you look around and realize you're living a completely different life. April brought pushback. His coworker, Sarah, someone Marcus had considered a friend, pulled him aside after a meeting. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice dripping with concern that felt more like judgment. "Yeah, why?" "You're just different lately. People are talking." Marcus felt the familiar pull to apologize, to shrink back down, to reassure her that he wasn't actually changing, just going through a phase. But instead he asked, "Different how?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, like you're trying too hard? It feels kind of intense." Intense. That word again, the one people use when they want you to be smaller, when your growth makes them uncomfortable with their stagnation. "I'm just trying it all," Marcus said calmly. "That's the difference." Sarah didn't know what to say to that, because what she was really saying was, "Your transformation is making me question why I'm not transforming, and that makes me uncomfortable, so could you please stop?" But Marcus had learned something over the last few months. Other people's discomfort with your growth is not your problem to solve. His mother called that week worried. "Emma told me you're talking about making big changes?" "Maybe. I don't know yet." "Marcus, you have a good job, stable income, benefits. Maybe you should just focus on being grateful for what you have." Translation: please don't take risks, because your risk-taking reminds me of all the risks I never took. His father sent a LinkedIn article about the dangers of career changes in your late 30s. No message attached, just the article link. Translation: I'm worried about you, but I don't know how to say it, so here's an article that says what I'm feeling. Even Derek, who had inspired so much of this shift, sent a cautionary text. Just make sure you're not making changes out of panic. Real transformation takes time. And Marcus appreciated the concern, he really did. But he also knew that the people warning you against change are often the ones who need you to stay the same. Because your transformation forces them to confront their own choices, their own comfort, their own compromises. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. So they'll disguise their discomfort as concern, frame their fear as wisdom, project their limitations onto your possibilities. Marcus had to make a choice. Listen to the chorus of voices telling him to slow down, be careful, stay safe, or trust the quiet voice inside himself that knew he couldn't go back to sleepwalking through life. He chose the quiet voice. Not because he was suddenly brave, not because he stopped caring what people thought, but because he'd finally realized something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Is less than hash 0. 6 hash is greater than. Staying the same hurts too. It just hurts quieter. It's the kind of pain you can hide from people, the kind you can endure for years without anyone noticing. But it's pain all the same. Stagnation has a cost. Silence has a cost. Comfort has a cost. And Marcus finally understood he'd been paying that cost with his entire life. So he made a decision, not loud, not heroic, not Instagram worthy, just a quiet sentence whispered into an empty, "I'm done living small." That was it. Not a plan, not a strategy, a declaration. And once he said it, things began to shift in ways he didn't expect. The next morning, he walked into work with the same clothes, same ID badge, same cubicle, but a completely different energy. Instead of shrinking into the background, he walked with intention. Instead of waiting to be told what to do, he volunteered for a project everyone else avoided. Instead of eating lunch alone in his car, he sat at the communal table, awkward, uncomfortable, but present. Because transformation isn't about becoming a new person overnight. It's about acting like the person you promised yourself you'd become. And people noticed. Some were supportive, some were confused, some were threatened. But Marcus didn't care, not anymore. Because once you stop sleeping through your life, you start realizing how many people around you are still asleep, and you stop trying to fit in with them. 2 weeks later, something happened that would have terrified him months before, but now felt inevitable. His boss called him into his office. "Marcus, I've been watching you these last few months. You're different, more engaged, more confident, more invested." Marcus didn't apologize, didn't downplay it, didn't shrink. He simply nodded. His boss leaned forward. "We have an internal position opening up, bigger role, more responsibility, more visibility. You should apply." Marcus froze for a moment, not from fear, but from realization. If he hadn't changed, this opportunity wouldn't exist. It wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It was alignment. When you rise internally, the external world eventually adjusts to match. That night, Marcus sat on his couch with the application open on his laptop. Old him would have overthought it. New him simply started typing. Not perfectly, not confidently, but honestly. Because the person who had once convinced himself he had nothing to offer was beginning to see that his story, the stuckness, the honesty, the quiet rebuilding was exactly what made him powerful. When he hit submit, he didn't feel fear. He felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. Pride. Not because he expected to win, but because he finally showed up for himself. And that's when the real breakthrough hit him, not as motivation, but as clarity. My life only stays small when I do. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Proud of you. Mom told me what you're doing. Don't stop." He smiled. Small but real. Because support hits different when you finally believe you deserve it. Later that night, Marcus stood by his window, looking out at the city lights, and whispered something that once would have felt impossible. "I'm becoming someone I'm excited to wake up as." And that was the moment everything truly changed. Not the job, not the conversations, not the Christmas meltdown, but the shift in identity. Not who he was, not who he used to be, but who he finally allowed himself to become. And now comes the part no one talks about. Transformation isn't one decision, it's thousands. Small ones, quiet ones, unseen ones, but they compound. And they create a version of you the old you would never believe. So, let me ask you, if this Christmas forced you to look in the mirror, what do you see? And more importantly, who are you finally ready to become? Because the turning point of your life won't be New Year's Day. It'll be the day you decide you're done pretending, done shrinking, done living on autopilot, just like Marcus. And if you're still here, listening to this, maybe today is that day for you. And if you're ready to take this even further, if you're ready to make today the day everything quietly shifts, then don't stop here. Because your next step, your real step, is waiting for you in the next video. How to fix your entire life in one day. Not someday, not next month, not after everything feels perfect. One day, one shift, one decision. If this video opened your eyes, the next one will show you exactly how to use that moment before it fades. I'll meet you there.